They said the blade was French, sharp enough to sever without pain, clean enough to keep her beauty intact as it fell. But no blade is clean, no silence is painless, and no woman dies without leaving behind a shape in the air where her breath used to be. She came into the world with fire in her eyes and left it under a sky that would not weep. On that final morning, as the ravens did not scream, the wind did not howl, it was a death so silent, it desecrated sound itself. A death so rehearsed, it had the rhythm of theater, but none of its mercy. Anne Boleyn, crowned queen by desire and defiance, now stood beneath the cold kiss of execution, wrapped in linen prayers and perfumed dread. They called her a witch, a seductress, a traitor to her king and to God. But long before her blood touched the stones, the truth had already drowned in candle wax and ink, sealed behind letters never sent and glances never returned. What is a queen, after all? But a mirror in which a king glimpses his own corruption. He adored her until she threatened to eclipse him. And so he plucked her out of history like a thorn pretending it was mercy. But the body remembers. The air still carries the echo of her kneeling. The scaffold, long since rotted, remembers the weight of her final breath. She did not scream. That, perhaps, was her last rebellion. They say it was over in one stroke. But history lies gently when it speaks of kings. What it doesn't record is the chill in her fingertips, the copper in her mouth, the fragile tremble in the lips that once seduced an empire. This is not a story of justice, or love, or punishment. This is the story of a ghost carved out of flesh, a woman crowned with fire and burned by silence. She was not born in a palace, but in the quiet shadow of ambition, H0rribIe Castle, where stones spoke of rain more than crowns, and her cradle was carved more by desire than destiny. Anne Boleyn did not walk into court like a lamb, nor was she led there. She was pulled into its orbit as a storm is summoned to sea, reluctant yet inevitable. Her eyes, dark as polished onyx, held the weight of unshed truths and futures not yet betrayed. She learned early how silence could be sharper than a blade, how a smile could be both invitation and trap, how a glance could bend the knee of a king or break the back of a rival. She did not speak often in her youth, but when she did, her voice sounded as if it remembered something ancient. They called her clever, dangerous, foreign. But it was not her tongue that made men tremble, it was her restraint. In a court where women clung to whispers and silk, she wore her ambition like armor. France had seasoned her, educated her in poisons of etiquette, the velvet edge of a well-timed nod, the elegance of spiritual disguise. And when she returned to England, it was not with reverence, but with precision. She stepped onto courtly soil like a ghost come to collect. Henry VIII, that bloated son around whom all courtiers orbited, turned to her not with affection, but with hunger. She refused him, not once, not twice, but enough to make him mistake resistance for virtue, silence for chastity, distance for divinity. And so he pursued her as men pursue the impossible. Not because they believe they will reach it, but because they fear what will become of them if they don't. She became his mirror, and in her reflection he saw not his power, but its limit. When he pressed her, she recoiled. When he offered her jewels, she offered him riddles. And still, he followed, the queen who bore him a daughter. Catherine of Aragon, aged into solemn devotion, became background to Anne's sharpened presence. Anne, who refused to be mistress, who insisted on crown or silence, became the riddle no priest could solve. He divorced Rome before he would release her from his mind. He burned bridges, men, monasteries, all for a woman who had not yet lain in his bed. And when she finally did, it was not pleasure that awaited him. It was prophecy. For Anne, the bed was not a throne. It was an altar. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, flame-haired and silent-eyed. Not the heir he demanded, but the curse he deserved. The court watched with measured terror as Anne navigated her crown like a knife's edge. She did not yield, not to the nobles who spat behind her back, not to the servants who prayed she would fall, not to the silence of a king who grew colder with every passing moon. She dressed in black velvet and spoke with fire, always just on the edge of blasphemy. Her enemies called her arrogant, her allies called her brave. But Anne knew she was neither. She was simply necessary. In a world ruled by male names and papal ink, she had forged herself into something that could not be ignored. But necessity does not guarantee safety. The courtiers who bowed before her did so with hands hiding daggers. The poets who praised her kissed her feet and dreamed of her ruin. Her chamber was lined with spies, her prayers pierced by eyes in the dark. Even the walls whispered that queens do not last long in the arms of tyrants. Henry had begun to shift. His glances, once molten, grew cold. The heat of pursuit replaced by the rot of possession. The man who tore apart Christendom to taste her skin now dined in silence, eyes distant, fingers tapping the table like a judge awaiting confession. And Anne, too proud to beg, too aware to hope, began to hear the ticking beneath the music. She was no longer the obsession, she was the obstruction, the queen who would not birth a son, the woman whose presence now made him look old. And so the smiles at court widened while the air grew tighter. Her sister, once her reflection, now her warning. Jane Seymour, pale and patient, waited in the wings like a candle beside a pyre. Anne walked the halls of Whitehall with the poise of a martyr not yet burned. Every tapestry seemed to narrow. Every meal tasted faintly of betrayal. She clutched her daughter to her chest and felt the blade already drawing its path across her neck. Henry no longer touched her, but he did not need to. His absence became the signal, his coldness, the drumbeat of exile. The courtiers learned to look away. The priests resumed their whispers. The queen's shadow lengthened, and the throne beneath her feet began to moan. She prayed in silence now, not to be spared, but to be seen, to be remembered not as the fallen whore they were already painting in their sermons, but as the storm that cracked the sky open. The court itself began to rot from within. Factions whispered of new alliances. Old flames stirred in forgotten corners. And Anne, the architect of her rise, became the prisoner of her own creation. She dined beneath ceilings that trembled with secrets, laughed in rooms that had begun to echo. Even her mirror no longer recognized her. Her hair, once polished chestnut, now hung limp beneath her coif. Her skin pale not with fear but fatigue. The king had moved his gaze, and with it, her soul was unthreaded from power. Her coronation, once the most lavish England had seen, became a cruel joke mocked in song, erased from records, poisoned by time. She was now a queen in title alone. Her allies fell away like dead leaves. Her servants flinched when she entered. Her voice, once thunderous with wit, now rang hollow. Still, she did not beg. She did not kneel. Even as the court grew darker, even as the king's silence thickened into threat, Anne did not unravel. She wore her decline like she wore her jewels with dignity carved from defiance. They came for her not in blood, but in ink, not with swords, but with paper. A list of accusations so vile they could only be believed because they were impossible. Incest, adultery, conspiracy, treason. Truth was no longer needed, only narrative. The queen who once held the crown in trembling fingers now stood alone before the tide, knowing it was not her sins that damned her, but her presence. A woman who dared to say no, a wife who gave him a daughter, a queen who would not go quietly. And as the sky above London darkened, as the bells grew still and the court prepared its mask of civility, Anne watched from her window the shifting of power, the rustling of silk, the soft click of betrayal in polished shoes. She was not surprised, only silent. And that silence, terrible and regal, was more damning than any confession. The knives did not come with gleam, but with paper parchment creased and scrawled with the venom of men too cowardly to kill with their own hands. The conspiracy against Anne Boleyn did not erupt like fire. It curdled like milk left in the sun, slow, sour, and deliberate. The king did not announce her fall. He breathed it in silence, letting it spread through corridors like a scent only the damned could recognize. Thomas Cromwell moved like a shadow inside a cathedral, never running, only appearing where secrets bled and loyalties broke. He knew the Queen's power was fading, not because she sinned, but because she failed to produce the one miracle England demanded: a son carved from royal blood. That failure, natural and cruel, had become her original sin, and the court needed no more evidence. So Cromwell built his case not from truth, but from symmetry, stitching names into a net wide enough to catch her dignity, her brother, her friends, her breath. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, a man whose eyes had lingered too long on her sleeves, whose hands once brushed her hem, was seized first. His screams were buried beneath the tower, but the ink they extracted from him was louder than any cry. They made him say he lay with the Queen, and though his body was shattered, it was his words that did the real breaking. One by one, they followed George Boleyn, her own brother, twisted in the gallows of rumor, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, all men whose lives had touched Anne's too closely, too warmly, too conveniently. Cromwell did not need them guilty, only spoken of. The charges were etched like scripture, not to be questioned, only repeated. And Henry, that hollow shell of a once raging sun, nodded through each revelation as if it arrived from heaven itself. The king who once tore a church in half for her now could not bear the shape of her name. His face grew more swollen with each day, as though his body rebelled against the rotting theater he had written. Jane Seymour stood in waiting, hands folded, eyes lowered, the perfect image of fertile submission. Anne's doom was not sealed by action, but by arrangement. The world simply shifted and left her on the wrong side of its shadow. The trial was announced with fanfare, as if justice itself had returned to London in golden robes. But the air around the court reeked of performance. The judges bowed before the crown. Not the truth. Anne walked into her trial, not like a woman pleading innocence, but like a queen marching to her second coronation this time, into infamy. Her gown was of sober gray, her eyes unflinching, her voice sharpened by betrayal. She spoke not to defend herself, but to expose the farce. She did not weep. She named no names. Instead, she looked at each man who condemned her as though memorizing the shape of their guilt. Her brother stood trial with her, accused of lying with the sister whose childhood he once guarded. The court listened, pretended to gasp, and continued its march into moral decay. The charges were grotesque orgies imagined in candlelight, plots whispered in twisted tongues, treason born from mere survival. Anne did not ask for pity. She did not stoop. The more they accused, the more regal she appeared, as if their filth could not reach the marrow of her defiance. But even queens cannot stop time, and in the tower, the stones began to tighten around her breath. She waited, day after day, as footsteps came and left, as voices whispered outside her cell, as food arrived untouched and prayers went unanswered. The same Henry who once praised her grace now refused to see her. The man who once called her his soul now denied her even a final word. Executioners were summoned from France not for mercy, but to stage the ending cleanly. As though foreign steel could sanitize English sin, the court resumed its games. Now without her, Jane walked in gardens she had once passed through, Her child played with servants who used to curtsy to Anne. The world shifted as if she had already died. But Anne remained breathing. She laughed once, alone in her tower, not from madness, but from recognition this was always the ending written for women who rise too far. Her thoughts circled her daughter, Elizabeth, the bright silence in her legacy. They would erase Anne's name, burn her portraits, sever her memory from courtly sermons, but they could not unmake her blood. That, she knew, would burn for generations. In the dark of night, she heard the river and knew it would carry her story in its depths. Not the tale told by bishops, but the truth whispered in wet stone and broken petals. The tower guards avoided her gaze. The maids cried when they thought she could not hear. She forgave no one, but hated nothing. Hatred was beneath her. Her soul was no longer tethered to this architecture of betrayal, and yet her body remained. They rehearsed her death in silence, measured her step to the scaffold, studied the wind for the hour when no birds would sing. She was allowed to choose her clothing, her final meal, her last confession, but every choice was already poisoned. She dressed not as a queen, but as a woman unafraid of disappearance. Her hair was pinned tightly, her mouth dry. She walked barefoot not out of piety, but to feel the earth one last time. On the morning of her death, the court buzzed with feigned solemnity. Nobles gathered as if attending a masque, not a murder. The scaffold was dressed in clean cloth, the sword hidden until the final second, as though decapitation were a sacred rite, not state theater. Anne climbed with grace, looked into the faces of her spectators, and saw only cowards hiding behind gold. Her final words were not apology, but ritual. She prayed for the king, not to praise him, but to make her defiance immortal. She would die loyal, so his guilt could never die. The executioner knelt, asked forgiveness. She gave it with the voice of a woman who no longer belonged to this world. A breath, a pause, a glance toward the sky. She knelt in silence. The sword fell. Her head landed not with thud, but with hush, as if the world itself inhaled and refused to exhale. Blood soaked the linen, and no one moved. No trumpets, no crying, only silence deep, cavernous, holy. They carried her body in haste, buried it without ceremony beside the bones of the forgotten. No tomb, no requiem, just earth. The court did not mourn. The king remarried days later. The world turned, but Anne remained. In the eyes of her daughter, in the cracks of the throne, in every silence too deep to explain, betrayal did not end her. It immortalized her. The days that led to her death were not measured in hours, but in slow dissolutions, the withering of voices, the retreat of familiar faces, the soft corruption of air as the tower pressed closer to her lungs. Anne Boleyn, once draped in courtly noise, now sat wrapped in the quiet that only the condemned are permitted to understand. The tower did not hum, it listened. Every crack in the wall, every distant splash of water beyond the battlements seemed to conspire with memory. She no longer prayed with hope, but with rhythm. Repeating her words like a funeral march meant not to save her soul, but to keep it from vanishing too soon. Her body, lean from sleeplessness, floated between defiance and exhaustion. She would not scream. That was her vow. She would walk to the edge of history as a woman stripped of dignity but never of poise. She braided her own hair with trembling fingers the night before, alone with only candlelight and the whispers of ghosts she could almost name. In those hours, it was not Henry she thought of, nor the courtiers who would dress in black only to drink red and laugh. Before sunset, it was Elizabeth, her daughter, her unfinished echo, the flame she birthed into a kingdom that craved only sons. They would try to erase her. Anne knew this with clarity colder than steel. They would paint her as a succubus, a traitor, a whore who climbed too high on the back of seduction and fell by her own arrogance. But Elizabeth would carry a different story, not one taught but felt, pulsing in the blood behind her quiet eyes. In the solitude she would learn too early to accept. Anne wrote no farewell. Words were now enemies. The last letter, if it ever existed, vanished into the hands of those who knew the power of silence. The day before the execution, she confessed not to the charges, which were absurd even in their cruelty, but to the weight of being a woman who said no too often in a world ruled by men who mistook desire for entitlement. She confessed her faith, her failures, her fears, but she did not ask for mercy. Mercy would have been an insult now. It was not deliverance she longed for, but completion. The court outside had already shifted its gaze. Jane Seymour, demure in ivory, walked through the gardens like a sacrament. Her womb had become the throne now, but Anne would not grant her bitterness. What need has a ghost for jealousy? Her final morning arrived with a sky so pale it seemed ashamed. The air was still, unnaturally still, as if even the elements had been ordered to hold their breath. She dressed in red beneath a dark mantle, her sleeves trimmed with fur, symbol not of warmth, but ritual. Red for martyrdom, some would later whisper, but she chose it for remembrance. No one should be allowed to forget what color courage bleeds. Her steps toward the scaffold were light, not because she felt peace, but because she had already left her body behind. She saw the crowd and did not see them, only outlines, only watchers, eyes that would lie tomorrow about what they saw. She climbed with no tremor. The executioner bowed before her. He had practiced all night, not because he feared failure, but because he feared her. It is one thing to kill a sinner. It is another to sever a legend. Anne gave her last words with lips that no longer trembled. She prayed for the king twice, once for duty, once for damnation. Then she removed her headdress, her hair unloosened, caught the light one final time. She knelt, not as submission, but as defiance wrapped in grace. The sword fell from behind, unexpected, swift, rehearsed like a sacred act corrupted. Her body slumped forward with a softness that betrayed the violence. Her head rolled, mouth slightly open, eyes unfocused, not in pain, but as if looking past the scene, beyond the centuries. The crowd stood still. For a moment, it was holy, not because they witnessed justice, but because they glimpsed its absence. They buried her beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No stone, no flowers, no verse, just a thin box and a deeper silence. Yet history refused to let her rot. Her name became a warning, then a myth, then a prophecy. The daughter she left behind would rise, not just to rule, but to haunt. Elizabeth, sovereign of fire and silence, would speak with the eyes of a mother whose lips were severed. She would make no apologies, would marry no man, would bear no son, and still, she would outlive them all. Anne's blood returned, not as vengeance, but as dominion. Every law that once condemned her bent to the daughter's will. The men who orchestrated her ruin turned to dust before Elizabeth ever reached her throne. In portraits, Anne would reappear not in name, but in cheekbones, in gaze, in the elegant fury behind her daughter's poise. Her legacy was not justice, it was defiance fossilized. They had tried to make her absence a warning. Instead, it became a summons. Women remembered, not the facts, but the feeling, not the trial, but the silence. Anne Boleyn, the queen who knelt without sobbing, became a wound stitched into the fabric of monarchy. Every coronation after her carried a ghost. Every woman who walked too near a throne, who dared to speak too sharply, was whispered to be another Anne. And so the court rewrote her. In tapestries, she vanished. In sermons, she burned. In songs, she betrayed. But beneath all the erasure was the truth they could never bury. She stood when no one else dared to. She defied a king who mistook power for permanence. She spoke when silence was survival. And she died, not broken, but complete. Even now, the tower holds her echo. When the wind slips through the corridors and the moonlight hits the scaffold stones, it is not weeping that one hears. It is breath. It is the last breath of a queen who knew that even in death, she would not kneel to falsehood, that even headless, she would still be remembered upright, that the grave, like the crown, could not contain her. They buried her beneath stone too humble for a queen, in a grave without name, without symbol, without tears. But history does not sleep where it's told to. It curls beneath floorboards. It bleeds through walls. It waits for the silence to grow heavy enough to speak. Anne Boleyn was meant to vanish. That was the final cruelty. Not the sword, but the forgetting. Not the scaffold, but the hush that followed. And yet she lingers, in the tilt of her daughter's crown, in the eyes of women who stand where they are not welcome, in the corridors of power where her ghost treads, not to haunt, but to remind. Her death was not punishment, it was punctuation. A full stop at the end of a sentence too sharp for the world to finish reading. The sword that struck her did not sever her from history. It carved her into it. The breath she did not take became a storm that would outlive the men who silenced her. And even now, when the tower falls quiet and dusk spills across the river, there are those who say they feel it, that chill, that hush, that unseen presence kneeling beside the stones, not broken, not pleading, simply waiting for remembrance, for reckoning, for someone to say her name without flinching. Anne, a woman, a queen, a defiance so complete it needed to be decapitated to be contained. But the blade missed its mark. It took her head and left behind her fire. And the fire, no matter how much stone they piled on top, refused to die. It still burns beneath England's crown, quiet, patient, undeniable.